Okay, today we're going to talk about the radical phase of the French Revolution. This is the second phase, or the second revolution. It depends where you started from, either in August or September, either the storming of the Tuileries in August or the September massacres. So the September massacres took place over a few days. Over 1,500 prisoners were killed. Now, these prisoners were killed because they were feared counter-revolutionaries. Your reading talked about this. They were priests, they were nobles, they were afraid, the people of Paris were afraid that they were going to be a fifth column. They were going to be opposition to the revolution internally, as well as they're fighting the external enemies. So people were lined up and just beaten to death. I read one account where about 100 people, 100 prisoners were lined up. They were given a 1-minute trial each and beaten to death. Well, the rest of the people in line watched, and the next guy up was coming. Now, we get the creation of the National Convention. They replaced the Legislative Assembly, which had replaced the National Assembly. All right. So the National Convention, this is far more radical. They are far more left, and we'll talk about that, far more liberal than the Legislative Assembly, which had proved pretty incapable of running the show. And so from now, for the rest of the radical phase, we're going to be talking about the National Convention. Now, they are dominated by a group called the Jacobins. Okay, say Jacobin. It started as a debate society. It was one of many political clubs that was around in Paris at the time. And it's those Jacobins that drive much of the French Revolution, much of this radical phase of the French Revolution, much of this second French Revolution. Their symbol becomes this hat, the bonnet rouge, okay, and that little thing on it there in the middle, the little star type thing, that's called a cockade. We'll talk about that later. But the hat is a bonnet rouge, okay, and if you look up on my collection of hats up there, I actually have one up there, right? So keep an eye out. We'll see the bonnet rouge quite a bit. Now, another group that is really pushing this second phase of the revolution are the sans-culottes, the sans-culottes, we usually call them here. This is the Parisian working class. This is the urban poor. If you remember the Third Estate, the graph we looked at, the big blue section was the peasants. There was a significant yellow chunk, which was the bourgeoisie, and then we had the urban poor. Now, they're called sans-culottes, as was in your reading, because they don't wear short pants of the aristocrat. And they are really radicalized at this phase in the revolution, and they're really pushing the Jacobins and pushing a lot of what is going on. And you'll notice how many of them in these pictures are wearing the bonnet rouge. This next one is just a political cartoon of the sans-culottes. So take a look at that for a second. You can pause me here if you would like. Now, this next slide is really important, okay? This is the idea of the left and the right, right? This is where we get that idea. In America's political spectrum, the left is liberal and are the Democrats, and the right are conservatives, okay? And we get that from the National Convention. It's actually where they sat. If you look at the little bottom picture I have down there, you have the left, the right, and the middle. You sat with the group who you were voting with. Okay, so you have the royalists on the right, they're the monarchists. You have the plain, they were called, because they were low, they were set in the bottom front. And then you had the left. And on the left you had the Girondins, which is that in green there, Girodinis, the Girondins, which is named for the region of France they came from. And you have a group that's even further left. They're called the Montagnards, the mountain men. They felt they were so far left, they actually sat high up in the National Assembly room, in this big auditorium. That's why they were called the mountain. They couldn't get far enough left, so they went up. Okay? And so this is the political spectrum. This is what we're dealing with here. And increasingly in this second phase of the revolution, we're going to see the conflict isn't between the right and the left. The conflict actually comes between the left more so, between who is more left. So feel free to come back to this point if you want to look at the spectrum again, the political spectrum. It's at about 5 minutes in this video. Okay? This is an incredibly important part here. This is the motto of the French Revolution, especially during the radical phase. Okay, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberty, equality, and brotherhood is essentially what that means. And this became kind of the driving motto of the French Revolution during this phase. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, to the death. And you see once again the bonnet rouge on these symbols. Now, the economic policies of the National Convention, not surprisingly, are also far more radical than the economic policies of the Legislative Assembly. They abolished the monarchy and established a republic. All right, that is far more radical, far more liberal, far more left than a constitutional monarchy. They gave universal male suffrage. They are the first country in the world to even consider it. The United States, that bastion of liberal democracy, you had to be a landowner, a white male landowner to vote. Now France is saying, nope, every dude has the right to vote. They got rid of the last vestiges of feudalism that were hanging around, and they abolished slavery. There was slavery in the French colonies overseas. Now, their economic principles were what we call embryonic war socialism. That's what your book called it. Essentially, it was a planned economy. Okay, the government was running the economy. Now, this is going to become pretty significant because we're going to see Republican ideas and a planned economy become very closely associated, and not always with the positive way. The law of maxim, these are price controls, okay? The sans-culottes, the urban poor, they're the ones who insisted on these. The government is setting prices on goods like bread, especially, to keep price gouging to a minimum, to make sure people weren't just absolutely jacking up the price to make a profit. Now, the National Convention also brought about a cultural revolution, okay? They were trying to enlighten things, do things with reason. They standardized the weights and measures. They legalized divorce and changed inheritance laws. So they're trying to equalize things. They're trying to use reason to make society fair. If you want to take a minute to look over those in a little more detail, you can pause me here and do so. Okay, so we get the next step, the next kind of push in the French Revolution, in this iron chest, l'amour des fours, which was found in the Tuileries Palace. They found letters that Louis had been exchanging with Austria. And essentially this provided undeniable proof that Louis was working with foreigners to invade France. He was actually actively inviting people to invade his country. And this absolutely sealed his fate. I mean, it was bad enough that he and his wife tried to flee. This just absolutely sealed his fate. You see the depiction of Louis above the iron chest there as a serpent puking into a bonnet rouge, and this is the skeleton in his closet you see there. And that basically hastened his demise. He was found guilty, but then they only by one vote did they decide to execute him. So it was pretty close, obviously. Unanimously they agreed he was guilty. But even in this radical national convention, just under half of the people still didn't want to execute him, showing that this was still a pretty big deal to people. Regicide wasn't something that they took lightly. And so after this, he's no longer king. I mean, they had a republic. He isn't a king anymore. He's just Louis Capet. Kind of funny to think about that. And he is executed. Again, you see the bonnet rouge down there on the bottom of this propaganda. Now, really with the execution of the king, we get a specific part of the second phase, of this radical phase. Within this radical phase is you see just, a few month period of a reign of terror is what this is called. So from September 93 to July 94, this reign of terror is going to grip France. And your reading talked about this. Essentially, a small committee, one committee of the National Convention, the Committee of Public Safety, was given powers by the National Convention to take all measures necessary for internal and external defense of the Republic. All right, so this one committee is basically given dictatorial control to defend the Republic. And they decided they consciously wanted to use terror. They wanted to horrify conspirators that the blade of the law was hovering over them. And when they passed the law of suspects, the children of nobles, anybody who couldn't prove they supported the revolution was immediately suspect. And so, as the quote from Robespierre says up there, terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, and flexible. Let terror be the order of the day. They wanted to use terror to scare people to protect the revolution. Now, the three primary people of the Reign of Terror, Robespierre is the leading figure of the Reign of Terror. He is far and above the most significant of them. We also talk about Danton. He is a Montagnard. He was one of the leaders in suppressing the Guillotines. He was eventually sent to the guillotine himself, and might be just one of the ugliest men ever. Marat over there on the right, he was a newspaper man. He was a far left newspaper man. His newspaper was called The People's Friend. He has kind of a cool quote. He said, describing why he did what he did, he said, "I am the anger, the just anger of the people, and that is why they listen to me and believe me." Now, Marat died an early death. He was actually stabbed in the bathtub. No, he wasn't actually. He was stabbed in the chest. It'd be hard to stab someone in the bathtub and kill him. He was in the bathtub when he was, never mind. He was in the bathtub when he was stabbed. He was stabbed by a woman, actually, Charlotte Corday. And this is a Jacques-Louis David painting of the event that really kind of dramatizes it. He was in the tub because he had a horrible skin condition. Now, the guillotine became one of the most important symbols of the French Revolution. That's what was used to execute all of these people during the Reign of Terror and beyond. We talked about the motto of the French Revolution being Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. The guillotine is most concerned with the idea of égalité. If you remember when we talked about the 18th century, we talked about how poor people were tortured and drawn and quartered, and we remember going through that big whole torture scene, where the wealthy, when nobility, were just beheaded. It was kind of merciful. Well, the guillotine treated everybody the same, whether they were a peasant or ultimately the king. They met the same quick, swift, just punishment of the guillotine, and it just created a big mess. It was up on the scaffolding so people could see it from all around. It was a very big deal. This is a piece of British propaganda showing what the Brits thought of the guillotine, spewing fire, pouring blood. Once again, you see the bonnet rouge up there. And the French wrote a song about it. It shows its importance in the cultural development of the revolution. Now, this is kind of interesting. So we look at this and we think of the radical phase as a phase against nobility, as a phase against the last vestiges of the right. But I want you to take a minute and I want you to analyze this chart. You'll actually look at one that's similar to it later. And I want you to try and figure out why this is the case. Feel free to talk about it with somebody sitting around you if you'd like. So this would be a good place to pause and move on in a minute, Okay, it's time to shift gears to what's going on outside of France for just a moment here. Outside of France, war is obviously playing a huge role in this. The National Convention decides they want to export the revolution. They are radical and they want to push the revolution as far from France as they can. Not as far from France, but include other countries. So they declare war on everybody who's been hostile with them. They're already at war with Prussia and Austria, and they declare war on Great Britain, Spain, and Holland because they want to push the revolution, and they're tired of these people pushing at them. But they're constantly getting their butts kicked, the French are. Their armies still aren't unified. Their armies still aren't good. This political cartoon is pretty gross, actually, admittedly, but go ahead and read the explanation there. And then if you want to talk about it with somebody sitting around you, go ahead and do that. So now back to the concept of war. The Libyan Mass. This is one of the most important, one of the most significant turning points in the French Revolution that happens during this radical phase. The Libyan Mass is a massive, massive draft, the biggest in European history at that point. 800,000 soldiers were drafted in less than a year. This gave them by far the largest army in Europe. Now, this really demonstrated the creativity of the Committee of Public Safety. They are saying, we are going to do something that has never been done before and go ahead and put together an army that's big enough to defend all of us. Now, this is going to set the foundations for the future success of this army because they get all these men in and start training them, and they become very unified and motivated. Now, this is also a turning point in the history of warfare. It's now a total war. This isn't a handful of soldiers. This isn't peasants from different towns and different villages. 800,000. This is essentially every man between 18 and 30 is getting drafted into the army at some point or another. And so this is touching every aspect of society. Entire society and economy are mobilized for war. And that's what total war is. Now, one of the key parts of this is it was an army based on merit, not on birth. So think about how armies used to be with nobility and peasantry. And then think about what an army based on merit, not on birth, means. Go ahead and come back to me when you're done with that. Okay. This is from the book The Terror, which was a really good book by David Endres, The Merciless War for Freedom in Revolutionary France. I want you to go ahead and read this, so you have to pause me while you read this. The top part is the actual proclaiming of the Libyan Mass, and then the bottom part is Endres's explanation of it. And it's a great explanation. I think this will make it make more sense to you. So go ahead and read that, and then come on back to me. Okay, we're shifting gears again. All right, so we did domestically when we were talking about the Reign of Terror. We did war and the Libyan Mass. Now we're going to talk about religious terror. Okay, so this is once again within France. The Catholic Church was linked with counter-revolution because they were linked with the old regime, because they were linked with the the First Estate. The radicals thought the Catholic Church was counter-revolutionary. Okay, and so de-Christianization practices start to get passed by the National Convention. Basically, their thought was religion had no place in a rational, secular republic. In a republic based on reason, there shouldn't be religion. This is the furthest extent of the Enlightenment principles of reason and ration. This is taking it to its furthest step. Okay. Now, one of the first things they did was change the calendar. If you think about the calendar, it's based on the Bible. God created the world in 6 days and on the seventh rested. And so they were so radical, they wanted to completely change that perspective. And they do away with the old calendar and they create a Republican calendar. All right? They abolish Sundays and religious holidays. They named the months after seasonal and agricultural features. They divided it into 10-day decades instead of randomly 7 days, 10 days. It matched the metric system that they were adopting also. Okay, and the creation of the Republic was named Year One. Now, as you can imagine, a 10-day week and still only a 2-day weekend didn't sit real well with some of the workers, but we'll get there in a minute. Okay, this is a look at the calendar. Like I said, they named all of the days, or all of the months, rather, after seasonal characteristics. So you can take a look at that. This is the years. Eventually, spoiler alert, Napoleon's going to come in and undo this because he's like, this is ridiculous. Nobody can keep track of it. Other things that they did besides the calendar was banned the public exercise of religion. You weren't allowed to practice in public. They knew they wouldn't be able to ban religion totally, but they didn't want public displays of it. No PDR, I guess, so to speak. The civil constitution of the clergy. This is a pretty big vocab term I want you to know. Basically, it puts the Catholic Church under the French government. Priests had to take an oath of loyalty to the government. They had to declare their loyalty to this new radical government. All right, those who did not were called refractory or non-jurying priests. Those terms are going to come up every once in a while. Now, one of the big questions they had to decide what to do is what to do with this beautiful Notre Dame Cathedral. They don't want to get rid of it. It's the heart of Paris. The Parisians love it. So instead, they just took off the church crosses at the time and called it the Temple of Reason, which is good because it's beautiful, and I'm glad it's still there. They still wanted holidays, and so they created new holidays that weren't religious. And this is the Festival of the Supreme Being, kind of a very deist holiday, actually. Now, personally, Robespierre was against a lot of the de-Christianization policies. He didn't think they were a good idea, so this was kind of his compromise. It always reminds me of Festivus, those of you who are Seinfeld fans. There's the Festivus pole there, and they're doing feats of strength and airing grievances. Anyway, if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. This is a chart that talks about the density of juring priests and refractory priests, which ones, where you can see where the most priests who took the oath versus the ones who didn't. So I'll give you a second to look at that. You can always just pause me, obviously, if you need more time. Now, there was a lot of backlash to the de-Christianization movement. Not everybody liked it. It alienated a lot of the population, especially in the rural areas. I mean, you're asking people to fundamentally change their beliefs. You know, government's one thing, but religion, that's a whole different idea. And this backlash is really best exemplified by the Vendetta Revolt. Okay, the Vendetta Revolt is that area there just south of Brittany in West France. Okay, and it shows that there was people who were resistant to the revolution. They were resistant to the de-Christianization, but also just to the revolution in general. And that's a really important concept. It shows that this isn't a unified France. It's not everybody believing in all of these things. And the Vendetta Revolt is the biggest and one of the most significant outbreaks of the anti-revolutionary violence. Okay. Then you can see here there were very solid reasons for why there was a revolt in the Vendetta. They were tired of the draft. The peasants were still really heavily taxed. They didn't like the de-Christianization, and they really hadn't benefited from the sale of church lands. They didn't think they were getting what they should be getting. And so there is a huge rebellion. Now, another example of anti-revolutionary was the town of Lyon. The town of Lyon was rejecting the revolution. This is in southern France, and the town of Lyon just didn't accept the revolutionary mottos. They consistently sent back the revolutionary representatives that were sent to them. And so the government of the National Convention sent an army and bombarded the town and annihilated it, absolutely leveled it to the ground, and put a sign up that said something, I don't remember exactly what it is, but said something like, here is the former town of Lyon who rejected liberty. This is a political cartoon done by a supporter of the revolution. This is a woman holding her children. She has a gun to a keg of gunpowder, and there are people coming in from the Vendetta Revolt who are anti-revolutionary, and she's essentially saying she's willing to support the revolution, even if it means killing all of her kids and herself along with it. it was supposedly a true story, no really way to prove it one way or the other, but another interesting view of women in the revolution. Now, next we're going to look at a series of British propaganda, and I want you to look at them and analyze it. I want you to break down what's going on in each of these. So I'll just flip to it, and then you can pause and look at it. These are all British propaganda talking about the revolution. The French always said that the British were slaves because they had that monarchy and that non-universal male suffrage system. So this is the British contrasting that. Hey, look, the Bonnet Rouge. It was there, too. All right, now to wrap up our discussion. All right, the French victory at Fleurus. I don't know how to say it. So anyway, in June of 1794, France defeated an Austrian army in a major battle. Okay, now this was less than 200 miles from Paris. So the revolution was under intense pressure. These foreign armies are really pushing, and that's one of the things that intensified the terror. But now, all of a sudden, with this victory, that pressure wasn't there. And so we're going to see the reign of terror essentially come to an end because that military threat isn't there anymore. And this is pretty important. This is once again another example of foreign pressures or lack of foreign pressures impacting the revolution. We saw the reign of terror heighten when France was at war and getting pushed all over, and now it's going to back off. So that is the whole discussion. I know it went fast, but I also know you can pause me whenever you want. So you have plenty other things to do for me as far as the radical phase goes. Thank you for your attention with this, and we will have speed dating next time we get together.